They say the human mind can convince itself of anything to survive. But what happens when survival means accepting the unthinkable? In the heart of Chicago, during the glittering spectacle of the 1893 World's Fair, a charming pharmacist built a castle that drew in the hopeful, the dreamers, the desperate. They walked through his doors seeking opportunity, seeking shelter, seeking a new beginning. But the only thing they found was darkness. This is not just a story about evil. This is a story about how monsters hide in plain sight, wearing kind smiles and speaking gentle words. This is a story about the people who trusted, who hoped, who loved, and who paid the ultimate price for believing in the goodness of a man who had none. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you look at every stranger who offers you help, every building with too many locked doors, every person whose kindness seems just a little too perfect. This is the true story of H. Holmes and the Murder Castle, and the souls who never escaped its walls. The Castle of Dreams. The summer of 1893 blazed across Chicago with an intensity that seemed to match the city's ambitions. The world's Columbian Exposition had transformed the landscape into a wonderland of white buildings, electric lights, and impossible dreams. 27 million people would pour through those gates before the fair closed, each one seeking magic, seeking wonder, seeking something beyond the ordinary confines of their lives. And in the shadow of that magnificent spectacle, just 3 miles away in the Englewood neighborhood, stood another kind of marvel entirely. The building occupied an entire city block at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. 3 stories of elaborate architecture rose toward the sky, with turrets and bay windows, elaborate stonework, and an imposing presence that commanded attention. Local residents had watched it being constructed over the previous 3 years, had seen the parade of workers come and go, had noticed how none of them seemed to stay very long, but they thought little of it. After all, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes was a respected businessman, a licensed pharmacist who ran a successful drugstore on the ground floor. He was handsome, charming, always impeccably dressed, always ready with a smile and a kind word. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the man they called Dr. Holmes was born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire, that he had abandoned a wife and child, that he had left a trail of debts and suspicions across multiple states, and that the building he had constructed was designed with a singular, terrible purpose. Emily Patterson arrived in Chicago on a Tuesday in June, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag and clutching a newspaper clipping advertising rooms for rent. At 23, she had already lived more hardship than many experience in a lifetime. Her parents had died of influenza 2 years prior, leaving her alone in a small Pennsylvania town where opportunities for single women were limited to teaching, sewing, or marriage. Emily had tried teaching, but the pay barely covered her room and board. She had tried sewing, but the factory conditions had left her fingers bloody and her spirit broken. So when she read about the World's Fair, about the opportunities in Chicago, about a city that was building itself into the future, she had saved every penny she could, packed her few belongings, and bought a one-way train ticket to a new life. The journey had taken 2 days, and Emily stepped off the train at Union Station, exhausted, hungry, and terrified. The city was so much larger than she had imagined, so much louder, so much more overwhelming. The streets teemed with people speaking a dozen different languages, horses and carriages clattered past, and the buildings seemed to stretch up forever, blocking out the sky. She clutched her newspaper clipping and asked directions from a kindly-looking woman selling flowers on the corner. The woman pointed her toward the streetcar that would take her to Englewood, and Emily climbed aboard, watching the city transform around her as they traveled south. The grand buildings of the downtown gave way to neighborhoods, to shops and homes and tree-lined streets that felt almost manageable, almost like a place where a person could build a life. When she stepped off the streetcar at 63rd Street and saw the magnificent building that housed Holmes's pharmacy, her heart lifted for the first time in days. It looked substantial, respectable, exactly the kind of place where a young woman might find safe lodging and honest work. The ground floor windows displayed neat rows of medicine bottles, perfumes, and sundries. A sign in elegant script read, H. Holmes, pharmacist and proprietor. Emily pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed overhead. The interior of the pharmacy was cool and clean, with high ceilings and polished wood counters. The smell of medicinal herbs and lavender sachets filled the air, and behind the counter stood the most remarkable man Emily had ever seen. Dr. Holmes was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with thick dark hair swept back from a high forehead, a neat mustache, and eyes of the most striking blue. But it wasn't his physical appearance that captured attention. It was the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to give his complete and undivided attention to whoever stood before him. When he looked at you, you felt seen, understood, valued in a way that most people never bothered to make you feel. "Good afternoon," he said, and his voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of warmth that made it feel personal rather than merely polite. "How may I assist you today?" Emily clutched her carpetbag tighter and pulled out the newspaper clipping with trembling fingers. "I saw your advertisement, sir. For rooms to let? I've just arrived in Chicago, and I'm looking for lodging, clean lodging, in a respectable establishment." Holmes came around the counter, moving with easy grace, and took the clipping from her hand. His fingers were long and elegant, the fingers of a pianist or a surgeon. "Ah, yes, I do have rooms available. You've come at an excellent time, as it happens. I've just had a space open up on the 2nd floor, but forgive me, you look exhausted. Have you eaten today?" The question caught Emily off guard. She had been bracing herself for scrutiny, for questions about her background and her ability to pay, for the cold assessment she had received from every other landlord she had approached in her life. She had not expected kindness, and the unexpected warmth of it brought tears to her eyes before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, brushing at her face with her free hand. "It's been a very long journey. I didn't mean to be emotional." "Please, don't apologize," Holmes said, and now his voice carried genuine concern. "You've traveled far to reach our city, and you've been very brave to make such a journey alone. Come, sit for a moment." He guided her to a chair near the counter and disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a glass of water and a small plate of cookies. "These are from the bakery next door. Mrs. Schultz makes them fresh every morning. Please, have something while we talk about the room." Emily sipped the water gratefully and nibbled at a cookie, while Holmes pulled up a chair across from her. He didn't sit behind the counter, didn't maintain the formal distance of a businessman conducting a transaction. Instead, he sat as a friend might sit, leaning forward slightly, his expression open and interested. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "What brings a young woman to Chicago all alone?" And somehow, perhaps because she was so tired, perhaps because he seemed so genuinely interested, perhaps because she had been holding everything inside for so long, Emily found herself telling him everything. About her parents' death, about the loneliness of the small town, about her dreams of finding meaningful work in the city, about her hope of attending some of the exhibitions at the World's Fair, about wanting to build a life that meant something. Holmes listened to it all, nodding occasionally, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When she finally finished, he was quiet for a moment, then spoke with great gentleness. "You have been through a great deal, Miss Patterson, and you have done so with remarkable courage. I believe Chicago will be good to you, and I would be honored to help you in any way I can. The room I have available is comfortable and clean, with good light and a fine view of the street. The rent is $4 per week, which includes laundry service. I employ several young women here in the building, some who help in the pharmacy, others who work in the various businesses I operate upstairs. If you are interested, I may be able to offer you employment as well. I'm always looking for reliable, intelligent assistants." $4 per week was more than Emily had hoped to pay, but the prospect of employment in the same building made it manageable. And more than that, there was something about Dr. Holmes that made her feel safe, protected, understood in a way she hadn't felt since her father died. "That would be wonderful," she said, and for the first time in months she smiled with genuine happiness. "When might I see the room?" "Right now, if you'd like," Holmes said, standing and offering her his hand. She took it, and he helped her to her feet with the easy courtesy of a gentleman. "I'll show you around the building as well, so you can get a sense of your new home." He led her through a door behind the counter and into a hallway that ran the length of the building. The walls were papered in a tasteful burgundy pattern, and gas lamps in polished brass fixtures provided warm light. They passed several doors, all closed, and Emily noticed that each had a different kind of lock, some with simple keys, others with more elaborate mechanisms. "Security is very important to me," Holmes explained when he noticed her looking. Many of my tenants are young women living alone, and I want them to feel completely safe. Each room has its own lock, and I'm the only one with master keys, which I keep in a safe in my private office. No one enters your room without your permission. They climbed a staircase to the second floor, and here the hallway stretched in two directions, lined with more closed doors. The building felt larger on the inside than it had appeared from the street, almost maze-like in its layout. Holmes walked confidently, turning left and then right and left again, until Emily had completely lost her sense of direction. Finally, he stopped before a door marked with the number 7 and pulled out a key ring heavy with dozens of keys. He selected one, unlocked the door, and pushed it open, gesturing for Emily to enter first. The room was small but charming, with a single bed covered in a white chenille spread, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a wardrobe, a small desk with a chair, and a window that looked out over Wallace Street. The wallpaper was a delicate pattern of roses, and lace curtains filtered the afternoon light into something soft and peaceful. "It's perfect," Emily breathed, setting down her carpetbag and moving to the window. From here she could see people walking past on the street below, could see the neighboring buildings and a slice of sky. After weeks of uncertainty, after days of travel, after months of grief and struggle, she finally had a place that was hers. "I'm so glad you like it," Holmes said from the doorway. "I'll leave you to settle in. Come down to the pharmacy when you're ready, and we can discuss your employment and go over the house rules. Take your time. You've had a long journey and you deserve to rest." After he left, closing the door quietly behind him, Emily sat on the bed and let herself cry. But these were different tears from the ones she had shed so many times before. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. She had found a safe place. She had found a kind employer. She had found, she thought, a fresh start in a city full of possibility. If only she had known that the door Dr. Holmes had closed so gently behind him had more than one lock, and that the key she would be given wouldn't open all of them. If only she had noticed the faint smell of chemicals that permeated the building, stronger in some hallways than others. If only she had wondered why, in a building that supposedly housed many tenants, the hallways were always so quiet, so empty, so still. But Emily Patterson, like so many before her and so many who would come after, saw only what H. Holmes wanted her to see: kindness, opportunity, safety. The truth was hidden behind locked doors and buried in the basement. And by the time anyone realized it was there, it was far too late. The next morning, Emily woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of streetcars rattling past outside. For a moment she didn't know where she was, and then memory flooded back and she sat up with a smile. Her first full day in Chicago. Her first day of her new life. She washed at the basin, dressed in her best shirtwaist and skirt, pinned up her hair, and studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked tired, she thought, and thin, but there was something new in her eyes. Hope, perhaps. Determination. She made her way downstairs, trying to memorize the turns and corridors, and found the pharmacy already open and busy. Dr. Holmes stood behind the counter helping an elderly gentleman select a tonic, and he looked up as she entered, giving her a warm smile. "Good morning, Miss Patterson. I trust you slept well? Come, let me introduce you to some of your neighbors." He gestured to a young woman who was arranging bottles on a shelf near the back. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with fair hair and a sweet, round face. "This is Miss Julia Connor. Julia, this is our newest tenant, Miss Emily Patterson." Julia came forward and shook Emily's hand with genuine warmth. "Oh, how wonderful. It's so nice to have another young woman in the building. Dr. Holmes takes such good care of us all. You'll be very happy here, I'm sure of it." "Julia works in the pharmacy 3 days a week," Holmes explained, "and she also helps with bookkeeping for my other business ventures. She's been with me for nearly a year now, haven't you, Julia?" 14 months, Julia said proudly. "It's been the best position I've ever had. Dr. Holmes is so understanding about my daughter." "I'm a widow," she explained to Emily, "with a little girl, Pearl. She's 8 years old and the light of my life. Dr. Holmes allows me to bring her to work sometimes when I can't find other care for her. Children should be with their mothers whenever possible," Holmes said with great sincerity. "Family is the most important thing in this world. I would never ask an employee to choose between her livelihood and her cheap LD." Emily felt her initial good impression of her new employer deepen into something close to admiration. How rare to find a man, especially a businessman, who valued women and children so highly, who treated his female employees with such respect and consideration. Over the next few hours, Holmes taught Emily the basics of the pharmacy business. She learned how to measure and mix simple tonics, how to keep the inventory ledgers, how to interact with customers with professionalism and care. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always encouraging. When she made mistakes, he corrected her gently. When she did well, he praised her sincerely. "You have a natural aptitude for this," he told her after she had successfully prepared a cough syrup following his instructions. "I think you're going to be an excellent addition to our little enterprise." The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Emily worked in the pharmacy from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with an hour break for lunch. Dr. Holmes paid her $8 per week, which after her $4 rent left her with more money than she had ever had in her life. She began saving for a new dress, for books, for a trip to the World's Fair. She became friends with Julia Connor, and they often took their lunch break together, sitting in a small courtyard behind the building and talking about their lives, their dreams, their hopes. Julia told her about her late husband, who had died in an accident at the stockyards, about the struggle of raising Pearl alone, about how Dr. Holmes had saved them both by offering her employment and affordable lodging. "He's like a guardian angel," Julia said one afternoon, her eyes soft with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done without him. Pearl adores him, you know. He brings her little gifts, candy and hair ribbons. He never forgets her birthday. He's so kind." Emily had seen Dr. Holmes with Pearl, had watched the way he knelt down to speak to the child at her level, the way he listened to her childish stories with apparent fascination, the way he made her laugh. It touched her heart to see a man who could be so gentle, so attentive to a little girl who wasn't even his own child. But there were small things, odd things, that Emily noticed but couldn't quite put together into a pattern that made sense. The building was large, supposedly housing dozens of tenants, yet Emily rarely saw anyone besides herself, Julia, and occasionally Julia's daughter. The hallways were always empty, always silent. When she asked Julia about this, the other woman shrugged. "Most of the tenants work during the day," she said, "and Dr. Holmes values privacy, so we all tend to keep to ourselves. It's actually quite nice, I think. Peaceful." Then there were the sounds at night. Emily's room was on the second floor, but sometimes late at night she heard noises from below. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, sometimes what sounded like furniture being moved or something heavy being dragged across the floor. Once, she could have sworn she heard crying, a woman's voice sobbing in desperate, muffled anguish, but when she opened her door and looked into the hallway, there was nothing. No one, just empty silence and the flickering gas lamps. She mentioned this to Dr. Holmes the next day, and he smiled reassuringly. "Old building. Settle and creak," he said, "and sound travels in strange ways through the walls and pipes. I'm sorry if it disturbed your sleep. Would you like me to move you to a different room? I have one on the third floor that might be quieter." But Emily had grown fond of her room, of her view of the street, and she declined. The noises weren't that bad, she told herself. She was just being silly, letting her imagination run away with her in the darkness. The weeks passed, summer deepening into July, the heat becoming oppressive, trapped between the buildings and rising from the pavement in shimmering waves. Emily had been living at Holmes's building for 6 weeks when Julia stopped coming to work. "Is she ill?" Emily asked Dr. Holmes when Julia failed to appear for the third day in a row. Holmes's face took on an expression of deep sadness. "I'm afraid Julia has left us," he said quietly. "She received an offer of marriage from a gentleman in Iowa, and she decided to accept it. It was all very sudden. She came to me a few days ago, asked for her final wages, and left on the next train with Pearl. I'm very happy for her, of course. She deserves a fresh start, a husband who can provide for her and her daughter. But I will miss her terribly. She was like family to me." Emily felt a strange twist in her chest, something that wasn't quite right, though she couldn't say why. Julia had never mentioned any suitor, had never spoken of wanting to remarry, had never said anything about leaving Chicago. But perhaps it had all happened very quickly. Perhaps it was a whirlwind romance. Perhaps Julia had simply kept it private. "Did she leave an address?" Emily asked. I'd like to write to her, wish her well." "She didn't," Holmes said with what seemed like genuine regret. "She was in such a rush, you understand, eager to begin her new life. But I'm sure we'll hear from her eventually. In the meantime, I'll need you to take over more of her responsibilities here in the pharmacy. I'll increase your wages to $10 per week." Does that seem fair? It was more than fair, and Emily agreed, though she couldn't shake a feeling of unease that settled over her like a shadow. That night she lay in bed and thought about Julia, about sweet little Pearl, about the way Dr. Holmes had described their departure. There was something wrong with the story, something that didn't fit, but Emily couldn't put her finger on what it was. She tried to tell herself she was being paranoid, that she was looking for problems where none existed. Dr. Holmes had been nothing but kind to her, nothing but generous and supportive. Why would he lie about Julia leaving? What possible reason could he have? But that night, the noises from below came again, and this time they were unmistakable. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, a door opening, the creak of hinges that needed oil, and then, faintly but clearly, a woman's voice calling out, "Please, someone help me, please!" Emily sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening, but the voice didn't come again. The building had fallen silent as a tomb. She wanted to go look, wanted to open her door and investigate, but fear held her frozen. What if it wasn't real? What if she had imagined it or dreamed it? What if she opened her door and found something she didn't want to see? In the morning, she told herself she had been dreaming, that the heat and her worries about Julia had conjured phantoms in her sleeping mind. She went downstairs to the pharmacy and threw herself into her work, trying to lose herself in the familiar tasks of measuring and mixing, of helping customers, of keeping busy. Dr. Holmes was in an excellent mood that day, whistling as he worked, making jokes with the customers, treating Emily with even more warmth than usual. He brought her flowers in the afternoon, a bouquet of summer roses. "For you," he said, presenting them with a small bow, "to brighten your workspace. You've been looking a bit melancholy lately, and I wanted to see you smile." Emily took the flowers, touched by the gesture despite her lingering unease. "Thank you, Dr. Holmes, that's very thoughtful." "I care about your happiness, Emily," he said, and his blue eyes held hers with an intensity that was both flattering and somehow disturbing. "I want you to know that you're safe here, that you're valued here, that you're important to me. I hope you'll be with me for a very long time." The words should have been comforting, but instead they sent a chill down Emily's spine. There was something in the way he said them, something in the way he looked at her, that felt less like kindness and more like possession. That evening, after the pharmacy closed, Emily made a decision. She would go to the third floor, the floor she had never visited, the floor where Dr. Holmes had his private apartments and where he supposedly kept his office. She would find proof that Julia had left of her own accord, find some record or note that would put her fears to rest. She waited until late, until the building had fallen into its usual nighttime silence, and then she crept from her room with a candle clutched in one hand. The hallways were dark, the gas lamps turned down low, and her shadow danced enormous and distorted on the walls as she moved toward the staircase. The stairs to the third floor were narrower than those to the second, and they twisted as they climbed, disorienting in the flickering candlelight. At the top, Emily found herself in a hallway that was different from the others. The walls here were bare brick, unpainted and rough. The doors were heavier, metal rather than wood, and there were no numbers on them, no indication of what lay beyond. She tried the first door and found it locked, the second door as well. The third door, however, opened when she turned the handle, swinging inward with a groan that seemed loud as a scream in the silence. Emily held up her candle and peered inside. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, bolted to the floor with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. The walls were stained with something dark, and the smell that hit her was chemical and sharp, burning her nostrils and making her eyes water. She backed out of the room, her hand over her mouth, her mind rejecting what she had just seen. There had to be an explanation, a reasonable explanation. Perhaps it was a room for medical procedures, for patients who needed to be restrained for their own safety during treatment. Dr. Holmes was a pharmacist after all. He had medical knowledge. Perhaps he treated people here sometimes. But even as she tried to convince herself, she knew she was lying. No ethical procedure would leave stains like that on the walls. No legitimate treatment would require a room with no windows, no ventilation, nothing but that terrible chair and those leather straps. She should leave. She should go back to her room, pack her few belongings, and leave this building in the dead of night. She should run and never look back. But where would she go? She had no money saved yet, no friends in the city besides Julia, who was gone, no family to take her in. And more than that, what if she was wrong? What if there was an innocent explanation and she was letting her imagination make her paranoid? Emily forced herself to breathe, to think rationally. She would wait, she would watch, she would be careful. And if she saw anything else suspicious, anything else that confirmed her fears, then she would leave no matter what it cost her. She made her way back to her room, her candle flame guttering in the drafts that seemed to move through the building like breath. She locked her door, the simple lock that she had, not knowing that there were other locks on the outside, locks she couldn't control. And in his office on the 3rd floor, seated at his desk with a ledger open before him, H. Holmes made a note in his careful, precise handwriting. He had seen Emily go up the stairs, had watched her through one of the many hidden peepholes that honeycombed the building. He had let her open that door, let her see just enough to make her afraid, to make her vulnerable. Fear, he had learned, made people easier to control. Fear made them doubt themselves, made them question their own perceptions, made them stay when they should run. He smiled to himself in the RK-ness, and turned the page of his ledger, looking at the names written there in columns. Some were crossed out, their business concluded. Some were still active, still useful. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote a new name at the bottom of the current page, Emily Patterson. And beneath it, in parentheses, he added, soon, the truth behind the walls. The summer heat had turned Chicago into a furnace, and the crowds at the World's Fair moved sluggishly through the great white buildings, seeking shade and cool water. But in Englewood, in the building at 63rd and Wallace, the air was thick and still, heavy with secrets that had nowhere to go. Emily had stopped sleeping well. Every night she lay awake, in her bed, listening to the sounds of the building, trying to separate the innocent creaks and settles from the footsteps, the dragging sounds, the occasional cry that might have been a cat or might have been something far worse. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook when she measured out medicine in the pharmacy. Dr. Holmes noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "You look exhausted, my dear," he said one morning in late July, his blue eyes filled with concern. "Are you feeling ill? Perhaps you should take a few days to rest. I can manage the pharmacy alone for a while." But Emily knew, with an instinct she couldn't name, that taking to her bed would be the worst thing she could do. As long as she was visible, as long as she was working and useful, she was safe. It was the women who disappeared into their rooms, who became isolated and dependent, who seemed to vanish without explanation. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just the heat. I'm not used to such warm summers." "Well, you must take care of yourself," Holmes said, reaching out to touch her cheek with his long fingers. The gesture should have been comforting, paternal even, but it made Emily's skin crawl. "You're very valuable to me, Emily. I would be quite distressed if anything happened to you." That afternoon, a new woman arrived at the building. Emily was working at the counter when the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see a young woman entering, clearly pregnant, and moving with the careful waddle of someone in her final months. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and tired eyes, and she carried a small suitcase in one hand. Dr. Holmes emerged from the back room with his usual warm smile, and Emily watched as the scene she had lived through 2 months ago played out again. The kindness, the attention, the offer of lodging and employment, the promises of safety and support. The woman's name was Anna Williams, and she had come from Minnesota, fleeing from an abusive husband. She had no family, no friends in Chicago, no resources except the few dollars in her purse and the desperate hope that the city might offer her a fresh start. "You've come to exactly the right place," Holmes told her, his voice rich with sympathy. "I have a room that will be perfect for you, quiet and comfortable, and when your baby comes, I'll make sure you have everything you need. I'm a man of some medical training, you know. I can assist with the birth if necessary, and I'll ask no questions about your circumstances. All that matters is that you and your child are safe." Anna Williams wept with gratitude, and Emily felt her stomach turn. "Shh," E wanted to scream, wanted to grab this woman by the arm and drag her out of the building, wanted to warn her that the kindness was a trap, that the promises were lies, that the safety was an illusion. But what could she say? What proof did she have? An empty room with a chair and stains, noises in the night that might be nothing, a former employee who had left to get married. If she spoke up, Holmes would simply explain it all away, would make Emily look hysterical and foolish, and Anna would trust him even more because he had been so patient with his unreasonable, paranoid employee. So Emily said nothing, and she hated herself for her silence. Holmes showed Anna upstairs, and Emily was left alone in the pharmacy, her hands clenched into fists, her heart racing with frustration and fear. She had to do something. She couldn't just wait for whatever was going to happen. But what? What could one powerless woman do against a man like Holmes? The answer came to her suddenly. Clearly she needed to find evidence. Real evidence, undeniable proof of whatever Holmes was doing in this building. And she needed to find it before it was too late, before Anna Williams and her unborn child became the next names crossed off in Holmes's ledger. That night, Emily waited until the building was dark and quiet, and then she left her room again, moving as silently as she could through the hallways. She had spent the day thinking about the building's layout, about the strange angles and unnecessary corridors, about how much larger it seemed inside than it should be. Buildings, she reasoned, didn't have empty space. If there were corridors that seemed to go nowhere, if there were walls that seemed thicker than they should be, then there must be hidden rooms, secret spaces between the visible areas. She started on the second floor, moving along the hallway and tapping on the walls, listening for the hollow sound that might indicate empty space beyond. Most of the walls were solid, but then near the end of the east corridor, her knuckles hit a section that sounded different, deeper, more resonant. Emily ran her hands over the wallpaper, looking for a seam, a crack, any indication of a hidden door. Her fingers found a small irregularity in the pattern, and when she pressed it, she heard a click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Her candle revealed a space no more than 3 feet wide, with walls of bare brick and a floor covered in dust. The passage ran parallel to the hallway she had just left, and as Emily moved down it, she found more doors, these ones opening into tiny rooms no bigger than closets. The first room was empty except for more of those terrible stains on the walls and floor. The second contained a pile of women's clothing, dresses and chemises and corsets, all neatly folded as if their owners might return for them at any moment. The third room made Emily's breath stop in her throat. It was small, barely large enough to turn around in, with smooth walls and a heavy door. But what made it horrible was the inside of the door. It was covered in scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood where fingernails had clawed and scraped, where someone had tried desperately, frantically, hopelessly to get out. Emily backed away from that room, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She knew with absolute certainty what Holmes was doing, what this building truly was. It wasn't a boarding house or a business. It was a trap, a killing ground, a place where vulnerable women were lured in with promises of safety and then murdered in the darkness. She had to get out. She had to get Anna Williams out. She had to find a policeman, find someone who would listen, someone who would believe her. But as she turned to leave, to flee back through the secret passage and down to her room, she found her way blocked. Dr. Holmes stood in the narrow corridor, his tall frame filling the space completely, and in the flickering light of his own candle, his handsome face looked like something from a nightmare. "Oh, Emily," he said, and his voice held disappointment, sadness, and something else, something that might have been eagerness. "I had such high hopes for you. I thought you might be different, that you might be content to simply do your work and not ask questions. But you're just like all the others, aren't you? Curious, suspicious, unable to simply accept the kindness you're offered." Emily tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The passage behind her led only deeper into the maze of Holmes's creation, further from safety, further from escape. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I won't tell anyone. I'll leave tonight. I'll go back east. You'll never see me again." Holmes shook his head slowly. "We both know that's not true. You'd go straight to the police, tell them your wild stories about hidden rooms and strange noises. They might not believe you at first, but eventually someone would investigate. someone would start asking questions, and I can't have that, Emily. I've worked too hard, built too carefully, to let it all be destroyed by one frightened girl. He stepped toward her, and Emily screamed. She screamed with all the breath in her lungs, screamed for help, screamed for someone, anyone to hear her and come running. But the building swallowed her screams, absorbed them into its walls and corridors, and no one came, no one heard. In a building that supposedly housed dozens of people, Emily's cries for help went unanswered, lost in the labyrinth that Holmes had designed for exactly this purpose. Holmes reached for her, and Emily did the only thing she could think of. She threw her candle at him. The flame touched his jacket, and for a moment, fire bloomed bright. Holmes cursed and batted at it, and in that moment of distraction, Emily ducked under his arm and ran. She ran blindly through the passage, taking turns at random, pushing through doors and stumbling down stairs she hadn't known were there. The building was a nightmare of corridors and rooms, some furnished, some empty, some that looked like they had been prepared for specific purposes, with ropes and chains and devices whose function Emily didn't want to contemplate. She could hear Holmes behind her, his footsteps quick and confident. He knew every inch of this place, knew every turn and door and secret passage. She was a mouse in a maze, and he was the cat who had designed it. Emily burst through a door and found herself in a large room that smelled of chemicals, sharp and acrid. There were tables here, and on the tables were things she couldn't fully process in the dim light from the single window, shapes that might have been equipment or might have been something worse. In the corner stood a large furnace, its door hanging open, and even from across the room Emily could feel the heat radiating from it. This was it, she realized. This was where Holmes disposed of his victims, burning them to ash, erasing all evidence of his crimes. And this was where she would end if she didn't find a way out. She looked around frantically and spotted another door on the far side of the room. She ran for it, praying it wasn't locked, praying it led somewhere other than deeper into this house of horrors. Her hand closed on the knob, twisted, and the door swung open onto a stairwell. Emily plunged down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps, momentum carrying her forward. She could hear Holmes above her, could hear him calling her name in that same gentle, concerned voice he had used when he offered her cookies and water on her first day. "Emily, please, you're going to hurt yourself. Stop running and let's talk about this. I'm not going to harm you. I just want to explain." But his explanations were lies, all lies. Everything about him had always been lies. Emily reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in the basement, a vast space of brick and shadow with pipes running overhead and puddles of standing water on the floor. She ran through the darkness, her hands outstretched, feeling her way past wooden posts and piles of coal and things she couldn't identify. And then, ahead of her, she saw it, a rectangle of lighter darkness, a doorway leading to a ramp that sloped upward toward the street. Emily put on a final burst of speed, her lungs burning, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She reached the ramp, started up it, and then a hand closed on her ankle and pulled. She went down hard, her chin cracking against the brick, her teeth cutting into her tongue. Blood filled her mouth as Holmes dragged her backward, away from the exit, away from freedom. "No," Emily sobbed, clawing at the floor, trying to find purchase, trying to escape his grip. "No, please, no." Holmes flipped her over, and in the faint light from the basement windows she saw his face. The mask of kindness had fallen away completely, and what looked back at her was something cold and empty, something that wore a human shape but had nothing human inside it. "I really am sorry about this," he said, and he might have been apologizing for stepping on her foot or arriving late to an appointment. "You seemed like such a nice girl. But you've made this necessary, and I've learned not to hesitate when necessity calls." His hands closed around her throat, and Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She clawed at his face, his arms, anything she could reach, but he was so much stronger than her, so much larger, and the pressure on her windpipe was crushing, unbearable. The world started to go gray at the edges, darkness creeping in like fog, and Emily knew she was dying. She was going to die in this basement, at the hands of this monster, and no one would ever know what happened to her. She would simply disappear, like Julia, like Anna Williams would disappear, like so many others had disappeared. And then, suddenly, light flooded the basement. Brilliant, bright light from multiple lanterns and voices shouting, and the pressure on her throat released as Holmes jerked away from her. Emily gasped, drawing air into her starved lungs, coughing and retching on the floor. Through tears and darkness, she saw men pouring into the basement, men in police uniforms, men with weapons drawn, men surrounding Holmes and forcing him to the ground. Miss, are you all right?" Someone was kneeling beside her, helping her sit up, and Emily looked into the face of a young police officer whose eyes were full of concern. "Anna," Emily croaked, her throat damaged, her voice barely working. "Anna Williams, 3rd floor, pregnant, save her." The officer shouted to his colleagues, and several of them ran up the basement stairs into the building. The officer stayed with Emily, helping her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way up the ramp and out into the night. The street was full of police wagons and officers, and a small crowd had gathered despite the late hour. Emily stood in the cool night air, breathing, living, unable to believe she had escaped. "How?" she managed to ask the officer. "How did you know?" "We've been watching this building for weeks," he said, "ever since the family of one of the missing women hired a private investigator. He reported suspicious activity, and we've been trying to gather enough evidence for a warrant. Then tonight we heard you screaming. That gave us probable cause to enter immediately." Her screams had saved her, the sounds she had heard for weeks, the cries for help that no one answered. Tonight her own cries had been heard. More officers emerged from the building, and with them came Anna Williams, wrapped in a blanket, weeping but alive. They had found her in her room, locked in from the outside, already drugged. With something Holmes had given her under the guise of medicine for her pregnancy. And then the real discoveries began. Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over Chicago, the police explored Holmes's castle and found the truth of what had been happening there. They found the hidden passages and the secret rooms. They found the torture devices and the acid vats and the furnace that still contained fragments of bone. They found pits of quicklime in the basement. They found evidence of surgery, of dissection, of bodies being systematically dismantled and destroyed. And they found personal effects, hundreds of them, jewelry and letters, photographs and locks of hair, all the small precious things that people carried with them, all that remained of the women who had trusted the wrong man. In the pharmacy, in Holmes's private office, they found detailed records. He had kept meticulous notes of his victims, their names and descriptions, what methods he had used, how long it had taken, what he had learned from each one. He had approached murder with the systematic precision of a scientist conducting experiments, and the evidence suggested that the number of his victims was staggering. Conservative estimates would later put the count at least 9 confirmed victims, but many believed the true number was far higher, perhaps 27 or even more. Julia Connor's name was in his ledger, as was Pearl's. They had not gone to Iowa to start a new life. They had died in the castle, their bodies disposed of in the basement, their belongings sold or kept as trophies. H. Holmes was arrested that night and eventually charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial became a sensation, newspapers across the country running lurid details about the murder castle and the man who had built it. He was convicted of the murder of his associate Benjamin Pitezel and was hanged on May 7, 1896. Emily Patterson survived, though she carried the scars of that night for the rest of her life. The damage to her throat affected her voice, leaving it permanently hoarse, and she suffered from nightmares for years afterward. But she also found a purpose in her survival. She became an advocate for women's safety, traveling the country and speaking about her experience, warning young women about the dangers of trusting too quickly, of accepting offers that seemed too good to be true. She helped establish boarding houses specifically for working women, places with proper security and oversight, places where vulnerable young women could live without fear. She never married, never had children, but she touched countless lives through her work. And she made sure that Julia Connor and Pearl, and all the other victims whose names were known, were remembered not as statistics or cautionary tales, but as real people who had deserved better, who had deserved to live. The building at 63rd and Wallace was eventually destroyed, torn down and removed as if the city could erase the horror by eliminating the structure that had housed it. But the story remained, a dark chapter in Chicago's history, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil often wears a kind face and speaks with a gentle voice. 20 years after that terrible night, Emily Patterson stood before an audience of young women at a settlement house in Boston. Her hair was gray now and lines marked her face, but her eyes were still sharp, still watchful, and her damaged voice still carried power. "I tell you my story," she said, "not to frighten you, but to teach you. There are people in this world who will seek to take advantage of your vulnerability, your hope, your trust. They will offer you exactly what you need, say exactly what you want to hear, and they will do it with such conviction that you will want to believe them. But I want you to remember that you have instincts, intuitions, that voice inside you that says something is wrong even when you can't articulate why. Listen to that voice. Trust yourself, and never, never let kindness from a stranger make you ignore the warning signs that your gut is giving you. I survived because I questioned, because I searched for the truth even when I was afraid, because I screamed for help even when I thought no one would hear me. You have that same strength inside you, every one of you. Use it, trust it, and know that your life, your safety, your well-being is worth fighting for, always." The women in the audience sat in silence for a moment, and then they began to applaud. Some were crying, moved by Emily's words and her courage. Others sat with determined expressions, absorbing the lessons, preparing themselves for the dangers they might face. After the talk, a young woman approached Emily, perhaps 19 years old, with anxious eyes and work-worn hands. "Miss Patterson," she said quietly, "there's a man at the factory where I work. He's been very kind to me, offering to help me find better lodging, better employment. Everything you said tonight, it reminded me of him. He seems so nice. But something feels wrong. What should I do?" Emily took the young woman's hands in hers and looked into her eyes with great seriousness. "Trust that feeling," she said. "That wrongness you sense, that's your survival instinct trying to protect you. Thank him politely, decline his help, and stay away from him. Your instincts are trying to save your life. Let them." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and squeezed Emily's hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for warning us." And Emily realized that this was why she had survived, why she had been spared when so many others had not. Not because she was special or chosen or more deserving, but because her survival gave her the opportunity to protect others, to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves, to turn her trauma into something that might, in some small way, make the world safer for the vulnerable and afraid. The legacy of H. Holmes's Murder Castle lived on, not just as a horror story to frighten people in the dark, but as a lesson about the nature of evil, about how it hides in plain sight, about how it exploits the very best parts of human nature, our capacity for trust and hope and belief in the goodness of others. But it also became a testament to resilience, to the strength of those who survived, to the importance of listening to our instincts, and to the power of speaking the truth even when that truth is difficult to hear. Emily Patterson lived to be 73 years old, and when she died peacefully in her sleep in 1943, she was surrounded by the women she had helped, the lives she had saved, the legacy she had built from the ashes of her trauma. At her funeral, someone read a poem she had written late in life, a poem that captured everything she had learned from her brush with evil. Trust, but verify. Hope, but watch. Believe in goodness, but remember that evil exists. And know that the greatest strength you have is not in your ability to see the good in everyone, but in your willingness to see the truth in anyone. Your life is precious, your safety is paramount, and no one's kindness, no matter how it gleams, is worth sacrificing your vigilance or your voice. Speak, question, survive, and in surviving, teach others to do the same. The story of the Murder Castle remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, a reminder that the late 19th century's rapid urbanization and the vulnerability of women in that era created opportunities for predators to operate with terrifying efficiency. But it's also a story about courage, about the women who fought back, who escaped, who testified, who refused to let their trauma silence them. And in that refusal, in that determination to turn suffering into purpose, there is hope. Not the naive hope that evil doesn't exist, but the stronger hope that comes from knowing that even when we encounter the worst humanity has to offer, we can survive it, we can speak about it, and we can work to ensure that others are protected from it. The building is gone, torn down and paved over, but the lessons remain. Trust your instincts. Question offers that seem too good to be true. Understand that kindness can be a mask, that charm can be a weapon, that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem the most helpful. But also remember that you are not helpless, that your voice matters, that your survival matters, and that by speaking your truth, you might save someone else's life. Emily Patterson understood this, lived this, and taught it until her dying day. And because she did, countless other women survived situations that might otherwise have destroyed them. That is the real story of the murder castle, not just the horror of what happened within its walls, but the triumph of those who escaped it, and the lives they went on to save through their courage in speaking the truth. In the end, H. Holmes built his castle to be a monument to his own twisted brilliance, a place where he could exercise complete control over the vulnerable and afraid. But instead, it became a monument to something else entirely, to the resilience of the human spirit, to the importance of vigilance and voice, and to the truth that even the darkest evil cannot extinguish the light of those who refuse to be silenced. The wealthy man built a house no one escaped, but that's not quite true. Emily Patterson escaped, Anna Williams escaped, and through their survival and their willingness to speak, they helped countless others escape situations that might have otherwise trapped them. That is the legacy that endures, longer and stronger than any building, longer and stronger than any evil, the legacy of survival, of truth, of voices raised in warning and in hope. Remember their names, remember their courage, and remember that your instincts, your voice, and your life are worth protecting, always.